Hello, I'm Esther Githu-Ewart. It's Tuesday, September 27th. This is Africa 54.
More Sudanese youth are moving north to seek a brighter future in Egypt. Are they finding it? We'll have a report. In Nigeria, floods kill hundreds and displace at least 100,000 more as heavy rains pound the northeast region. October is Sickle Cell Awareness Month. We hear from an expert on what you need to know about the disease and the challenges it poses to many across Africa.
We begin in Northeast Africa, where more and more Sudanese youth are heading north to Egypt as they flee economic hardship. The exodus reflects a growing gloom over prospects at home. Paul Ndiho has more.
Travel agencies are helping young Sudanese seek a brighter economic future in Egypt. The migration reflects the stark reality of what's happening at home, where the economy is in a free fall, and the UN says food shortages are affecting 1/3 of the population. More people and water cuts are expected, and anti-army protests have rocketed the nation's streets since a coup 1 year ago. However, one Sudanese citizen says Egypt is not his final destination.
Egypt is not for stability. Egypt is for crossing, so we will go to Egypt as a stop. We will stay there for 2 or 3 months to collect 1,000 or 2 that would take you back to the Libyan border. Then you go to the place next to Alexandria called Marsa Matruh, an entrance to Libya. There you will go to Kufra, where you will stay for 6 to 7 months.
Following the military takeover, which toppled a civilian-led government, the number of those leaving has accelerated. According to travel agents and migrants, young Sudanese can travel to Egypt cheaply and hunt for work, while families seek healthcare, education for their children, and a more stable life.
The country has countless problems. The schedule of universities has many problems. If university usually takes 4 to 5 years, it now takes from 6 to 7 years, depending on what you study. This is one of many problems. Universities won't be able to continue like this because of protests and roadblocks. This is one of the main reasons these people leave Sudan to study abroad.
The owner of a Khartoum bus company says as many as 30 buses are taking around 1,500 passengers each day to Egypt, which he says is up to 50% from last year. Despite sharp ticket price increases, in addition to travel agents estimate that the number of young Sudanese men seeking to make the journey to Egypt has doubled since last year. Over the past 4 years, the Sudanese pound has depreciated by 950%, while fuel, once subsidized, has become more expensive in many wealthier countries. The International Organization for Migration anticipates that more people will consider migrating from Sudan as an option. Critics, however, say that the circumstances in Egypt are also tricky, with inflation running at its highest in almost 4 years and nearly 25% of the country's youth are unemployed, according to the International Labour Organization. Sudanese youth often work menial jobs in factories, gold mines, or as domestic help, according to travel agents and migrants. However, they say they can earn more in Egypt than at home. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Emergency officials in Nigeria say flooding has killed at least 300 people this year and displaced at least 100,000 more. Authorities northeastern Yobe State say that heavy rain submerged roads and swept a major bridge linking the state capital and some local government areas in the worst flooding seen in years. Other states like Adamawa and Borno have experienced flooding due to higher than usual rains, which has swept across farms and added to the risk of food insecurity. Many people are stranded by overflowed rivers.
We have incurred huge losses because this farm which you're seeing here and other parts which we have not been to, every season we would harvest at least 200 bags, and this is just a conservative estimate. But now, with the current situation, we're not sure we'll even harvest half a bag here. This field has become completely barren. After the flood subsided, the rice was killed. Another disaster occurred. The bridge was washed away by the rain, which deposited sand and broken bitumen, covering the entire field. Now, we don't even have the field to plant the crops. We are calling on the government and international agencies to assist us. We are appealing to whoever can help to please show compassion and come to our aid because we have help.
Nigeria's National Emergency Management Agency says flooding has been unprecedented and 29 of the country's 36 states are affected. Kenya's worst drought in 4 decades has killed almost 2% of the world's rarest zebras in 3 months and 25 times more elephants than normal over the same period. It is starving Kenya's famed wildlife of normal food sources and driving them into deadly conflict with people as they roam wider to the edges of towns and villages in a desperate search for sustenance. Conservationists warn that without interventions to protect wildlife, or if the approaching rainy season fails again, animals in many parts of Kenya could face an existential crisis.
Since June, when we started supplementing the zebras, we've lost around 40 griffons have died. And it's a serious threat to us and also a fear that if we're losing 40 within 3 months, what will that mean to the remaining population? So we're working around hard, around the clock to feed the numbers to make sure that we make the population survive through the drought. Like right behind me is a group that we are feeding. It has a lot of foals. It's lactating females. If we didn't have to feed this or supplement these individuals, the mothers will not even be able to nurse their foals, and we'll have a lot of foals dying, and even the lactating females. Most of the zebras will die because we look around. It's only dry twigs around. They don't have much to pick. So we only come in that moment where it seems now like the hay is the only thing that they are surviving on. So if we didn't come in to supplement them, we'll have a lot of mortalities.
According to experts, overgrazing by livestock is also depleting rangelands and making it harder for ecosystems to recover from drought. Kenyan police authorities on Tuesday announced the death of prominent lawyer Paul Gisheru, who was charged at the International Criminal Court with bribing witnesses in the collapse trial of President William Ruto 6 years ago. Police say the cause of his death on Monday is currently unknown. Gisheru's body was found clean and casually dressed with no blood present. The report also revealed that Gisheru was a diabetic and that he had high blood pressure. He had been charged with 8 counts of offenses against the administration of justice and faced a maximum of 5 years in prison or a fine if convicted. The Kenya Human Rights Commission is expressing concern over his death and is calling for a swift and conclusive investigation. As we continue our analysis on the just concluded 77th United Nations General Assembly World Leaders Meeting in New York, I'm joined live via Skype from London by Rishon Chimboza, Africa Managing Director of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Rishon, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you very much, Esther.
So much was said by the world leaders at the UNGA meeting, but usually what action follows these powerful speeches?
Yeah, you know what? I think it's pretty easy to fall into the trap of always saying that these meetings end up being talk shops and the leaders go back home and start planning for the next one with very little follow-up that has actually happened. Rather, what we should be looking at is saying, with this General Assembly, how is it different from all other global dialogues that African leaders have attended? I certainly think that the geopolitical dynamics are very different to what they have been in the past, with Africa finding a much stronger voice for itself within global dialogue. This is the first General Assembly that has come together when we have the conflation of the Ukraine crisis, issues of vaccine equity, issues of climate justice, all debates where Africa has had a very strong voice. And we should also be cautious of falling into the trap of saying that the General Assembly has ceased to serve a purpose because it is just a talk shop. We shouldn't forget that this is the only platform where 193 members of the United Nations actually get together and discuss issues of relevance to the UN Charter. So I think it is still very much relevant. And when leaders go away, what is very different from this is African leaders coming back with a position to say, this is our perspective when it comes to the global geopolitical issues that we see.
Rishon, you mentioned African leaders, and so much was said about climate change. What do you anticipate the African leaders will put forth in the upcoming COP27 summit in Egypt?
So in terms of the tenets of the negotiating position, it's more about Africa saying these sorts of commitments that were made at the previous COP to fund adaptation and mitigation efforts towards net zero. What is the mechanism of actually deploying this type of financial support that is coming for Africa? Then I think there's going to be another plea that is going to come forward, which pretty much echoes a sentiment that President Macky Sall, in his role as chair of the Africa Union, made at the Africa Adaptation Summit in Rotterdam about 3 weeks ago, where he lamented the absence of leaders from Western states and also from global financial institutions from the private sector within debates regarding climate change, adaptation and mitigation with regards to how it affects Africa. So I think we're going to see a much more confident voice coming from Africa to say, right, we cannot do this alone. Who are the partners who are engaging in this debate? And it affects all of us, right? And for Africa, we also need space to be able to decide how we also look at issues such as energy security in the context of these much bigger debates around the financial commitments that the rest of the world has been speaking about dedicating towards adaptation and mitigation.
And very briefly, Rishon, there was wide condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do you expect world leaders to do? What action will they take against Russia in the coming days?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I could speak to the Africa position as signified by President Macky Sall, which was essentially saying for African leaders, they want to be in a position where they are given space to not be forced into picking a side. Not saying that the African leaders do not have a position with where they would want to be with regards to the invasion, but rather saying, give us space for us to say that this is what we think is within our interest as the African continent. So I certainly think that we're going to see more reinforcement of that type of messaging. But I also want to add to that and say, you know, not saying we're going with East or West if we're to simplify this debate. And in itself, it's not really a strategy per se. Mm-hmm. So what we'd also expect to see coming out of leaders, particularly from the Africa side, is this is what our position is. So we're not going left, we're not going west, we're not going east, right. But ultimately this is what we want for the continent, to make sure that we are not just an observer to this crisis unfolding.
Rishon, very well put. Thank you for your insight. Rishon Chimboza is the African Managing Director at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Leave no one behind. That's the core message of Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera at the just concluded United Nations General Assembly in New York. In a wide-ranging exclusive interview with VOA's Peter Clotty, President Chakwera addresses some of the challenges he is facing in Malawi, including fighting corruption, fuel shortages, and protests by civil society groups. The groups are calling on him to keep his campaign promises to improve living conditions.
My core message really was, leave no one behind. And 3 years ago, when they launched the Sustainable Development Goals till 2030, this was the theme, line, like you could say, running through all of these development goals. Let no one be left behind. And so I was reminding the world body that in the course of its activities, its programs, sometimes it has become evident that there are certain groups that are being left behind. Maybe not intentionally, but we must make mention of that in order for deliberate steps to be taken so no one is left behind. And I mentioned specifically some groups, countries like Malawi. I mentioned about countries within the least developed nations grouping. I mentioned about Africa having a seat, not just one, but a couple of seats, permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. And I mentioned several other things with regard to the crisis that we face and how we respond to this same. It's almost like some are left to fend for themselves in a burning house while others are being rescued. And so, as a world body, if just one is not safe, then all are not safe. We saw that in the pandemic, and we see this even in tackling issues to do with climate change. The disasters that we face, the crises that we face, even the geopolitical wars that are there, they are affecting everybody. And so it's important that at a world stage like this, people must be cognizant of the fact that what affects one affects all.
That was VOA's Peter Clotty speaking in an exclusive interview with Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera. Still to come, we'll have an update on the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. But first, Hedy Adams tells us what's on tap for Wednesday's Straight Talk Africa.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, we'll take a look at the race for digital supremacy on the African continent. China and the US have been competing for years. Who's surging ahead, and what does this really mean for you and the technology you use? Join me, Hedy Adams, and my guests as we discuss the battle for digital space in African countries.
In other African news, Niger's government says it has for the time being stopped issuing authorizations for oil deliveries to neighboring Mali unless Mali plans to join the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Niger. The Burkina Faso army says several people are feared dead following an attack Monday by Islamist militants on a 150-vehicle convoy taking supplies to a town in Soum province. And at least 5 people in Kenya, including 2 children, were killed Monday after a 6-story building collapsed outside Nairobi. The shadow of war clouded the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's celebration of the Meskel festival in the Addis Ababa Tuesday. The event was held amid low turnout, high security, and clergy preaching about the need for peace and forgiveness. The festival, which according to the church's teachings commemorates the finding by the Roman Empress Saint Helena in the 4th century of the true cross on which Jesus was crucified, is a high point of Ethiopia's religious calendar. Hundreds of priests, musicians and singers clad in traditional white robes gathered on Meskel Square in central Addis Ababa for a series of rituals culminating in the lighting of a giant bonfire.
Truly speaking, this year we Ethiopians are not celebrating the festival in full happiness. Partly because just like the mothers were crying under the cross, our mothers in the north are also crying. They're under suffering. This suffering is common for all of us. It's our own, of course, but there are external actors in it.
The war in Tigray, which erupted in November 2020 and has at various times spilled into other regions, has killed thousands of people, displaced many more, and left an estimated 13 million people in desperate need of food aid. It's time for a health report, and joining us now is Africa 54 health correspondent Lino Mudu with the latest on Ebola outbreak in Uganda. And also, Lino, take over. You have more.
Hello, Esther. Hello, everyone. Well, September is Sickle Cell Awareness Month. About 300,000 children are born with sickle cell disease every year, according to the World Health Organization. Sickle cell anemia is one of the most common genetic disorders in the world. The condition is more prevalent in certain ethnic groups, including people of African descent, as well as of Middle Eastern, Asian, Indian, and Mediterranean descent.
Sickle cell is the most important and most prevalent genetic disease in the African region. Globally, we have about 120 million people with sickle cell, and 60% of these are in the African region. To decentralize care to the lowest level of care available, which is the PHC, so that people that live in the rural and peri-urban areas can have access to this early diagnosis for sickle cell disease. So once they are diagnosed early, they follow a certain path of care. The other is on making sure that hydroxyurea is a medicine that has been shown to reduce frequency of sickle cell crisis in developed countries. Is a challenge in the region. It will also be important if hydroxyurea is made more accessible. In the African region, most countries with a high burden of sickle cell disease don't have newborn screening in place that is comprehensive enough.
In Uganda, about 20,000 to 25,000 children are born with sickle cell annually in the country. And out of that, between 50 to 80% do not cross to their 5th birthday. And this is quite alarming. This calls for a lot of intervention from quite a number of partners, not only the Ministry of Health. We have been in position to cause awareness and cause sensitization and also scale up testing in the country. Much as this is being done, there are also still other challenges. For example, there is lack of testing kits in certain areas, even in government facilities. And we are the only organization, apparently, that is doing testing for sickle cell traits in the country.
Now, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling on world leaders to step up their effort to end the coronavirus pandemic. Speaking at the meeting on ending COVID-19, he said the time is now to build, quote, political momentum to finish the job on COVID-19. Take a look.
It's time to build political momentum to finish the job on COVID-19. Let's get it done. Let's end this pandemic once and for all. We must close the booster gap. Vaccine booster coverage remains low everywhere, but low-income countries in particular are still struggling. with only 35% of healthcare workers and 31% of older populations fully vaccinated and boosted. Our top priority continues to be getting vaccines into arms. This must include addressing the shadow pandemic of vaccine hesitancy and countering misinformation with life-saving facts. Second, we must close the testing gap. Testing rates are plummeting everywhere, exposing the world to potential variants and undermining the rollout of new treatments. Giving these new medicines a chance means dramatically expanding testing and treatment coverage, especially for low and middle-income countries. And third, we must close the preparedness gap. Now is the time to strengthen our defense against future threats by investing in early warning systems, local manufacturing and diagnostic capabilities, and a well-paid, well-supplied health workforce. We must never be caught so unprepared again.
Thank you, Lino, for that health update, and thank you for watching Africa 54.
If Russia stops fighting, there will be peace. If Ukraine stops fighting, it will cease to exist as an independent nation. So we must stay the course for Ukraine's sake and for ours.
Our unity here at NATO, across our alliances and partnerships, at the United Nations and other international institutions, is essential to advancing our objectives, shared objectives, supporting Ukraine's capacity to defend itself, sustaining pressure on Russia for its aggression, ensuring that Ukraine is in the strongest position when conditions are right for negotiations. That support includes $675 million in new military aid to Ukraine. It includes more guided multiple launch rocket systems, artillery ammunition, high-speed anti-radiation missiles, anti-tank systems. President Putin thought that he would divide and weaken NATO. Today, the alliance is stronger, more unified, better resourced than ever before. Diplomacy is the only way to definitively end Russia's war of aggression. We see, in this moment, no indication from Russia that it would be prepared to seriously pursue such diplomacy, but if and when that time comes, Ukraine has to be in the strongest possible position. And that's why it's so vital that we stay the course, that we stay united. United in support of Ukraine, united with our allies and partners, united for as long as it takes.